Greetings, friends. Last week, a video popped up in my YouTube feed called Why Russia Loves Death More Than Life, Inside Russia's Death Cult. And I had to give it a listen. With such an outrageous claim, I had to know what the argument was. As it turns out, there is no real argument from the lady who made the video from a channel under her name, Elvira Bary. Well, I know she's Russian. I assume she's living in the West. Either way, she's thoroughly westernized in her distorted thinking. She has the advantage over me because she's from Russia. But as it happens, she makes terrible arguments. She was simply describing historical and cultural aspects of Russian society and then assuming that her conclusion that Russia was a death cult naturally followed. I didn't see how it followed at all. I actually thought she portrayed Russia very positively in the video when she talked specifically about their attitude towards death. It's almost like her audience is expecting to comprehend whatever her thesis is, regardless of what she actually says or describes. So originally I did take one on this video, and it was going to be a very long video because I included up to half of her video where I would respond to it, and she went on for about 32 minutes. I don't want that to happen again, so I'm trying to keep this a bit shorter. And also she really just delved into history, anthropology, and it became kind of off topic. I kept thinking to myself, how does this have anything to do with justifying the argument that Russia is a death cult? She didn't even define what she meant by death cult. It's just this derogatory word designed to shut you down in today's world. Like we do sometimes with good reason call the modern left a death cult. But it is to say that there's no reasoning with them, they're crazy. And we call Hamas a death cult, there's no reasoning with them, they're crazy. We call Russia, in her case, a death cult. There's no reasoning with them, they're orcs. They invaded for no reason other than the megalomania of Vladimir Putin. It's completely disconnected from reality. And how sad is it that Elvira Bary, assuming she's in the West, or if she's in Russia, but her whole channel seems to be criticizing Russia, including criticizing Russian culture itself. That's very sad. That's even a kind of witchcraft in some sense. How spiteful. How aggrieved. To give you an example of one of the things she says, which she thinks paints Russia negatively. She's talking about her attitude towards funerals.
In the West, death is often treated playfully. A skeleton dancing the macabre, a grim reaper with a scythe, or even a friendly character in books and films. But in Russia, the emotional code around death is entirely different. Death is both sacred and taboo, something you fear, respect, and never joke about openly. Almost every Russian who visits the United States reacts with shock to Halloween decorations. Hanging a plastic skeleton on your porch or scattering fake severed hands across the lawn feels unthinkable. It's a bad omen, almost dangerous.
Well, I've lived in Canada my whole life. I am Canadian, and I find many Halloween decorations extremely distasteful, even evil. In some situations, Halloween decorations could be dangerous if you believe in evil spirits, and also depending on in the fashion in which you use such decorations, they can attract evil spirits. Now, if you're just a materialist and you don't believe in these things, then you can just laugh at that, you can dismiss that. But many cultures would believe in such things. Most cultures, traditionally.
Of course, attitudes are slowly changing. Globalization and the internet melt cultures together, but traditional Russian culture treats death as a holy space that must not be mocked or trivialized. There's a Russian saying about the dead: one must speak either well or not at all. And it applies especially to family and people you know. Funerals and cemeteries are very serious, even sacred affairs. Families that struggle financially will still borrow money to ensure a proper burial with a grand headstone, a portrait, and an emotional inscription. When death comes, saving money is considered indecent.
The Russians traditionally treat death as a holy space that must not be mocked or trivialized. Does she think this makes the Russians look bad? Who wouldn't want their own society to be like that? When death comes, she says, saving money is considered indecent. Oh, imagine that. Grandma passed away. We better think of saving money now. Why not just have a Walmart funeral? Why not skip the funeral altogether? A poor family still finds a way to pay for a traditional, respectful burial for a loved one. Imagine the scandal. What kind of headspace is this lady in? Of course, a poor family who believes in the importance of dignifying the passing on of their family member or friend will go out of their way, even if it means prolonging their poverty, to see this person off in the right way. It doesn't matter, right, Elvira? Why pay a priest and some cantors to do a service? Why spend so much money on flowers, candles, the casket? After all, it's just a body, right? The person is gone, and what do they care what happens to their body?
When I was a child in Russia, I was surrounded by beautiful stories about dying. Not horror, not random accidents, but perfect deaths. A boy throwing himself under a tank, a girl blowing up a bridge, soldiers smiling as they walk toward bullets for the motherland. As a child, you don't question it. Adults hand you the script and you accept it as the natural order of things. Only much later do you look back at the books you read, the films that made you cry, the games you played, the fantasies you had at 7 years old, and you see the pattern. Everything pointed in one direction. A good Russian life was a life you were ready to give up. Not for yourself, but for something higher. That's when it hit me. I hadn't just grown up with a different attitude to death. I had grown up inside a death cult.
Early on in the video, she says that a good Russian life was a life you are ready to give up, not for yourself, but for something higher. It's just outrageous that she thinks this is a bad quality. You need an ideal of sacrifice. First of all, that's integral to the masculine identity, which propels a civilization to build, to expand, to protect. Ultimately, you have to sacrifice yourself for your family. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean sacrificing your life, but it's your time, your energy, your love. And God forbid, if you have to defend your family or there's a war, a famine, or some other event, then some men have given the ultimate sacrifice. And if there weren't enough men who could do that, and I'm weak, I've never been in that position, but we can certainly agree that that is a good ideal. Some men will make that sacrifice and it'll save the rest of us. It'll literally save our civilization. But apparently for Elvira Bary, this is a death cult. No, for me a death cult, a real death cult, would be something in the Old Testament times. One of those insane Middle Eastern tribes that did evil things like throwing infants into the fire for Moloch. That, you could say, is a death cult. And she seems unaware that in Orthodox Christianity, which forms a large component of Russian culture, Orthodoxy condemns suicide. That's a very, very bad sin, a sin you can never repent from. She conveniently omits this.
And it has nothing in common with how death is treated in places like the United States, with Halloween plastic skeletons on porches and quiet green cemeteries. The Russian relationship with death is its own emotional universe.
In America and Canada, we tend to be unsettled by corpses. We don't like to see dead bodies. We whisk away our loved ones when they pass and have their bodies burned to ashes. That's not the case with everyone, but it's very common. That's how it was with my parents. Those were their wishes. That's not how they do it in Orthodoxy. The body is to be treated very specially. They would not burn the body. They would honor the body as much as possible. They have a funeral service which includes a memorial the night before and then the actual funeral the next morning. So it's kind of like a 2-day affair. Then you go to the cemetery for the burial. Then there's a lunch or a banquet or something afterwards. During the funeral itself, or during the memorial perhaps, you have the opportunity to kiss the forehead of the deceased. Imagine Westerners doing that. They could never stomach that. They don't even want to see the body. Better just burn it, have it in a little vase. But no, in Orthodoxy, you're confronted with death face to face. You ask that the Lord will have mercy on the soul of the departed, and that the departed will forgive you for any wrongs you dealt them during your time with them. I'm speaking generally. I know not all Russians practice in the Orthodox fashion. Who is the stronger one, Elvira? Who is the stronger people in this regard? No, she's calling that a death cult.
Talking about death casually is avoided. Treating it without reverence feels like provoking fate. Once, while traveling in Romania, I wandered into a cemetery and was shocked to see gravestones already marked with birth dates, leaving an empty space for the future date of death. These were graves prepared in advance for living people. For Russians, this would be absolutely impossible, a terrible omen.
I'm not informed enough to comment on whether Russians have a superstition about reserving a grave in advance, being inviting death. Either way, whether you reserve a grave for yourself or another person in advance or you do not, this has nothing to say about whether your society is a death cult. Think of saying to someone, "Oh, I'm a bit superstitious about inviting death," and the person replies to you, "You're in a death cult."
In Russian culture, death itself functions like an indulgence. A person ignored or persecuted during their lifetime, writers, poets, thinkers, could suddenly be declared a genius the moment they die. Only then do they become worthy of a school curriculum or a national memorial. While you're alive, you cannot claim much. But the moment you die, you become significant. I remember going to the wake of a school friend who died in a car accident. She wrote songs, but no one paid much attention to them, just another girl scribbling lyrics. Yet as soon as she died, she was suddenly a prodigy. Her songs became popular. Her death made her matter. This reveals a deeper truth. Reverence for death spills onto the dead. The moment someone dies, they automatically become more important.
She talks about how people, when they die in Russian culture, then they become bigger than they were in their life. They might have been a person who was not noticed by general society in their life, then they pass away. Then something they did during their life gets recognized. Maybe the family and friends just build up a bit of a mythology around a certain person. Well, that might be true, but that happens in many cultures. You might even say it's a universal aspect of humanity. We have that in Orthodoxy with saints. From an anthropological view, this is sort of built into the human experience. Someone dies, you remember them, they leave a legacy. It does make them a bit bigger than how they were during life. They've approached into the beyond. They're in the transcendent. They're beyond the physical earth. What's the actual criticism here? What's the evidence? How does this show that Russia is a death cult? And I would point out that she confuses martyrs with heroes, with people who simply deserve recognition for things they did during their lifetime. You could not be a martyr within the Orthodox Church if you willingly sought death. If you had a reckless attitude to die, that's not going to get you martyrdom. Martyrs were those who gave their lives when all other options were exhausted, and in a spirit of love for God, they gave down their lives, usually in a situation to save others around them, or at least to finally take a stand against evil when their people were being persecuted, such as in the early centuries before Constantine legalized Christianity. They were not zealots for death by any stretch. Elvira does not have a good use of categories. Anything that generally fits the topic of death is fodder for her baseless claim.
This is why the staggering number of Soviet losses in World War II is directly tied to the moral weight of victory. Suggesting that the war could have been won with fewer deaths is a violation of every social and emotional norm. To diminish death is a moral crime.
At this point, Elvira is confusing two ideas. Number one, diminishing death, as in diminishing its spiritual significance. And number two, diminishing death, as in diminishing its actual fact on Earth. Of deaths on the battlefield, in other words, when other means to victory were present. She doesn't elaborate, she doesn't give the historical arguments to explain how Russia could have saved all these millions of lives more. Oh, they must have not made any mistakes against the very smart Nazi commanders. The USSR was up against the greatest military force that had ever threatened Eurasia since the Mongols, Nazi Germany. I think it's unfair. She seems to assume that Russian society is not mournful of all of these dead, that they were not traumatized by it, that they somehow wanted this death to occur. In such a contest, any mistake Russia made, or the USSR I should say, would cost millions of lives, and it did. But they won the war. The USSR caused 80% of German casualties. They were the main reason Nazi Germany was defeated. Yes, people can say Lend-Lease from the West was a big reason that Russia won because they had the support. But in terms of actual boots on the ground, it was completely Russia that shed the blood to capture Berlin. This required incredible human sacrifice, and only a people that had strong patriotism could accomplish such a feat. Only people with that would have the unity necessary. There were no meat wave human attacks on the Germans during the war, just like there aren't any meat wave attacks by Russians against the Ukrainians today. It's a myth. The movie Enemy at the Gates, with Jude Law as a Soviet sniper, and the scene where the Soviets are being forced to run forward into the machine guns, is based on a myth. This was truly an existential crisis for Russian civilization, and win the war they did, and preserve themselves and their legacy. That's a form of enduring life. But I don't know if Elvira and her audience would harbor such transcendental views.
In Imperial Russia, the sacredness of death was so powerful that funerals were the only form of political gathering allowed. People could assemble in large numbers, deliver symbolic speeches, even sing veiled protest songs, but only under the protection of a funeral. This cultural attitude formed for a simple reason. For centuries, in the Russian Empire, death was always close. Not only because people routinely died from epidemics, hunger, and war, but because individual life meant almost nothing to those in power. And rulers never missed an opportunity to remind people of that. For generations, Russia's most valuable resource was not land, industry, or technology. It was people, specifically a vast mass of illiterate peasants whose sole purpose was to serve the state and their landlords. Peasants belonged to the land like livestock. They reproduced quickly and they died quickly.
So after 9 minutes, I found it less useful to continue with her video. I mean, again, I said I was going to make this video shorter. It's already still going to be a long one because she's just talking more off topic, more of this anthropology history, which I don't even necessarily have anything to disagree with, or maybe I would disagree with some of her conclusions, but it's not really relevant anymore to the subject. Is Russia a death cult? We never got a good answer or argument, and you're not going to in the rest of her video. You can go and listen to it. I'll include a link in the description of this video. But I will briefly say that she complains about how the nobles in Russia were persecuting their peoples. Oh, wow, the nobles are bad and are sacrificing the lives of their peasants. Therefore, Russia is a death cult. And oh, the nobles didn't like their people and were mistreating their people. Like, that hasn't happened in practically every part of the world. So a lot of what she does say does actually reduce to just a general critique of humanity. She's describing the terrible medieval nature of Russian society up until 100 or 200 years ago. But I would counter by saying, wasn't it so great to be pressed into King George's navy in the 18th century and participate in mercantilism on a man of war on the high seas? Or wasn't it great to be dispossessed of your farmland by the local lords in Scotland or Northern England and forced to work as a coal miner in order to survive in the 19th century so that the Industrial Revolution could get going?
The ruling classes never pretended they were equals because they themselves were not culturally Russian. The elites were a rotating cast of outsiders, first Viking chieftains, then nobles shaped by Byzantine traditions, then Polish and later Dutch fashion, then a German dynasty, the monarchs who spoke French at home and treated Russia as a territory to command, not a homeland to share. This distance created a brutal logic. If the rulers saw themselves as foreigners, the people became disposable. A landlord could punish, imprison, sell, or kill a serf without almost no consequence. The Tsar could do the same to nobles. Justice and rights did not exist. Power did.
She says justice and rights did not exist, power did. Well, I wouldn't agree that justice never existed. I think rulers can exercise justice and did exercise justice in Russia. I don't think she would necessarily recognize that. I would agree with her that rights did not exist because rights are a social construct of the Enlightenment period. When we say rights, we usually mean the authorities will back us if things get tight, and we have to rely on them if a crime occurs and I hurt someone or I shot a home intruder and the court ends up taking my side in the matter. Then you get to say, oh yeah, I had the right to self-defense. You get to say it in the conclusion, in retrospect, oh yeah, I had the right, when in reality it's all based on power anyway. So she's right. Power did exist back then, and it still exists today because that's the reality of having a civilization, of having a society. But again, we're just getting off topic here. This is just becoming a discussion about the progressive worldview versus a more traditional worldview.
Under such conditions, what meaning could an ordinary life have? The only moment an anonymous peasant could rise above invisibility was through death, dying for the Tsar or for God.
Who is she to say that a peasant's life didn't have meaning in terms of their friends and family? What a claim to make.
In the early Soviet years, sacrifice became a form of identity. To be a new Soviet person meant dissolving your individuality into the collective, accepting that the state owned your body in labor, in punishment, and in war. Pop culture of the time was saturated with calls to self-sacrifice for the radiant communist future, a future no one could clearly describe. Newspapers were filled with appeals to struggle, overcome, and achieve victory. A life without struggle was declared vulgar and petty bourgeois.
She says around 15 minutes that a life without struggle in Russian culture is a life not to be celebrated. And again, what society would disagree with that? That's a positive attribute. So in conclusion, I would say she made a huge claim, an outrageous claim, which ended up being fully unjustified. She seems to confuse anthropological descriptions with logical arguments, pointing out that there were poor living conditions and many abortions in Soviet Russia and today in Russia doesn't mean it's a death cult. For one thing, you find those same conditions in the West. But if you want to ask who is the real death cult, if you really want to take on that term, it would be more honest to point to Britain, for example, the birthplace of eugenics, the Malthusian worldview. Thomas Malthus wrote of the need to reduce populations to combat a reduced food supply or environmental strains. These sorts of dystopian anti-human worldviews had their origin largely in Western Europe. Hasta luego, amigos!